This episode is brought to you by Rescue Intelitech, innovating solutions to keep firefighters safe. Their Solo Rescue Decon Washer helps reduce cancer risks by cleaning contaminated gear quickly and effectively. Learn more at rescueintelitech.com because clean gear saves lives.
Need reliable firefighting gear? From helmets to boots, find it all at thefirestore.com, trusted by first responders everywhere. Shop seasonal savings on the gear that keeps you ready.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Apparatus Workshop on fire apparatus and emergency equipment. My name is Nick Wilbur. Joined with me is Slauch as always. And as we've had before, the great Tom Shan is back again for another episode. And we're going to talk about reserve apparatus today, the state of the apparatus market, if you will, and kind of dive into the backup plans or secondary thought processes or how we can spec rigs to maybe lessen the out of service time and help the fleet survive the current market trend, I guess, is really the backbone of the conversation today. So a lot of questions that we get when we go places, we do fleet evaluations, we get phone calls from larger fleet managers. They ask, how many reserve apparatus do we need? And there's so many questions that come from that question. There's a lot of variety in how we can respond to that. And so I'm going to kind of toss that question out there first, and we're going to dive into it a little bit more. And to preface it, or to start, I guess, the conversation, we'll go to what ISO says. So if you follow the ISO rules for engines, for ladders, and service companies combined into a secondary category, for every one engine you have, for every 8 engines you have, you need 1 reserve form. So if you have 8 engines, you have 1 reserve. Once you go to the 9th engine, then you would need 2 reserves. Same thing for ladder/service companies. So if you had 6 ladder trucks and 2 service companies, you would then need 1 reserve for those. And so those are the numbers that are kind of out there in paper. Other than that, it kind of is up to the AHJ or the authority having jurisdiction. So, Tom, as the guest, I will throw the question to you first.
Interesting question and background. Just to back up a little bit from what ISO says now, historically going back, the predecessor of ISO was the National Board of Fire Underwriters. And their standards, which back in that era, 40s, 50s into the 60s, people ranked an NBFU requirement right up there with an NFPA requirement. It was gospel, cast in granite. And back then, the ratio was 1 reserve for every 5 engines, and for trucks, it was 1 for every 7. And since NBFU was typically just looking at the larger cities, rarely would you find somebody falling short of that mark. Even back then, if you think about whatever year you were born, think about what fire trucks looked like when you first went to a parade or buffed the station and said, hey, that's a fire truck. And even with the least amount of technology compared to where we are today, those were the ratios. I think a lot of it has to be based on your fleet, the size of your fleet, the number of frontline units, engines and trucks that you're putting up. And by hopefully doing good record keeping, whether it's from your fleet management software, from internally the folks that maintain the rigs for you, or if you go to use an outside vendor, you should be able to calculate and say, what's my actual in-service time? All right, if I look across the spectrum of my fleet, from the newest to the oldest rig, from the least active engine company where that's the retirement home, that's where I'd be, riding out the last couple of years, or you're in a busy downtown engine company and you're doing 15, 20 runs nominally during a 24-hour shift. It said, what's that piece of apparatus's performance standards as what's the benchmark of here's what you would like to be. Think about this maybe in terms of grading, in a school setting, where it's ABC or you get a numerical grade, which I guess they probably in education have gone away from. But if the benchmark for your in-service time, you're striving to do 90%, which would be phenomenal in most cases. All right. And you look at your actual numbers and say, well, here's what the numbers are telling me. That's giving you a percentage of time where the unit's unavailable. Well, now you need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. Okay, was it unavailable because I just have a very aggressive PM program, and on the busy units, they're racking up the engine hours and the mileage based on my PM criteria? Then I'm pulling that rig in every 90 to 120 days, as compared to a maybe an older vehicle in a slower station that doesn't see that much in service time on the street. Say, here's my benchmark and here's what I'm actually achieving. Everybody would go along, if you think about in a college setting, and say, well, I was striving to be a 3.0 student. And then you actually look at your GPA and go, whoa, can't show that to mom and dad. All right. So how are you doing against what your benchmark is? And if those numbers are falling far short of what your in-service time, what you're striving to achieve, that has a large impact then on how many reserve units you're going to need. If you find out that the majority of your fleet across the enterprise is falling short of that benchmark, then you need to maybe buckle up and increase the number of reserve units. Uh, like I say, it's always fun and games until the day in a career department when you show up for work and you see the officers on the phone talking to his battalion chief or somebody in fleet and saying, yeah, all right, the technician just started to do the checkout on the rig. It's out of service. What can you do for us? And momentarily they'll be like, we don't have anything for you here. We got to figure this out. Hold tight. You're out of service. We'll call you back in a couple of minutes. And I think in a lot of departments, they're finding, even with the newer fleets, which sometimes because of parts availability and warranty turnaround time, it's unlike, I think, taking your private vehicle to, where you bought your car. If you bought it back to the dealership, you make an appointment for a warranty issue. And the inclination is, even if you have to have your wife follow you with the other car, the inclination is you're going to pick it up later that day. Or if you're staying with the car, 2 hours and a couple cups of coffee later, I'm back out on the street. The inclination is, well, I'm not going to leave it here, and you're going to call me a week from Friday to let me know what's going on. And I think that just compounds itself. Where we are right now in the marketplace, it's making whoever's responsible, whether it's the fleet manager, internally or externally to the fire department, but the person that's in charge on a daily basis, making sure in a career department, there's a viable, safe rig to operate for every engine, ladder, and special service that you have in there. That's becoming quite challenging, and back in the day was probably something that's like, okay, I'm just trying to, put pins in the pegboard here and figure out where stuff's going to go. And then you see, occasionally you read about companies that are browned out, and maybe not necessarily browned out for staffing issues. They're browned out because we've run out of fire trucks, and we generally don't advertise that and put that on the electronic bulletin board in front of the station.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that 1 to 8 number is nice to be able to put on paper and to have something to kind of, I guess, quantify with. But I think that it kind of leads to two things, and Tom discussed it with the number of runs that you're doing per day and how busy those units are. But as you get over 10 plus runs a day, if you're not down to the 50% of reserves versus your frontline apparatus, I think you're going to run into trouble somewhere down the road to where you're out of something. And as we alluded to a little bit before this, as we were talking, I think you get much over 15 runs a day. You're almost in a 1-to-1 range to where you need to have something available to put that into it. But I think that that kind of leads, you have to look at what that ISO rating from both a career fire department and a volunteer fire department is. What does that mean? I mean, what's reserve mean? If a volunteer fire company has three engines, in their firehouse, do they need a reserve? Does one of those engines, can one of those engines count as that reserve that day? And then, if you fall back to ISO, and it's all kind of a language thing, if you have automatic aid agreements to where those engines can get built back into it, does that, can that one engine that you would normally run out third due, if you had the proper staffing that day, can that count as that reserve, and you just backfill it with automatic aid engine? So, I think that's another way to look at it. If we're talking about reserves, but does it make sense to have a dedicated reserve if you have three engines in your firehouse and you can just pull one of those up into that position too? So I think kind of looking at that as what does reserve mean, and kind of being able to identify that and make that fit your organization works as well, provided you're looking at how does that affect ISO. If everything's a mutual aid agreement, when you drop one of your third engine out, then that now starts to affect that rating. And if it's going to be a long-term thing, then you have to do something to kind of fix it. So again, what does it mean, but how does it affect everything else that you're looking at as well?
I think you have to look at the front side, which is what we're talking about now. But I look at it as the other side too. At College Park, we had the Big Ten football games. We would do special event staffing, right? So we go to many places where we do fleet evaluations, where the mission is not just forward-facing emergency response. There's a training component to it, where they're working with a local college to provide some sort of training or props or equipment for training. SWAT missions, where they're backing up the local police department and providing ambulance, EMS, fire coverage for, SWAT missions. You have the training aspects. So if you're in a fully careered fire department, most of the time in those middle to larger departments, there's not an engine assigned to training. It is a reserve engine that is just there available to be used for training. So although you may be looking at, well, all of our engines are in service and we may have used the reserves that we've had, but we've never run out of reserves. But what's the backside of it, right? If you have a 4th of July fireworks show and you need to staff additional units for that event, and you have no quote unquote reserves or additional units to staff, that's a problem. If you have training that needs to occur with driver training, pump operations training, just regular pulling hose line, firefighter 1, 2 training, and you have no spare reserve engines, that's a problem. So the mission, gets drawn out across the board. And we've faced that in Arlington, where if you have primary rigs out of service, that is what our training uses, is that reserve fleet. So if we start drawing that reserve fleet out, we may never run out of reserves, but at the end of the day, now we have no units available for the training academy. So now we're either pulling units out of service, we're shuffling, training sessions around, we're trying to make out of service rigs for XYZ used for training because the pump's not out of service, but something else might be out. It's a whole kind of shell game to make everything work. So I think some of that, we alluded to data a little bit earlier of that percentage of usage time and percentage of availability. I think it's also the other missions that those vehicles might serve. As an ambulance, if you only run one ambulance all the time, that's great. But when you have those major events and you have them 7 or 8 times a year, you have to upstaff to 2 or 3 transport units. It might be wise to have that many, 2 reserve transport units for your one, because those special event timeframes, you need all 3 to press them in service. And so those uses might not be high on that call volume when you're putting out your stats on your annual report, but that data or that usage is high. It's not shown in those call numbers. So we have to capture that data in another way. And again, when we're looking at the reserve or the backup side of things, we have to look at the entire picture. It's very easy to say 1 for 8, but if you're starting to talk about high run volume, secondary missions, training, things like that, it starts changing all of those numbers. Again, at the end of the day, that's more of a recommendation It's not real life to an extent, and not as a knock to ISO. There has to be something like you guys had mentioned on paper, but in today's environment, I think the whole game has kind of changed with what a quote unquote reserve looks like. And as the fleet may age, as Tom alluded to, that reserve might look different too. Because if you have an older reserve or older frontline fleet, your reserves are probably older, and you might just need more because everything's getting older, and it's just going to be harder to get parts, more customized parts to replace things that might not be available anymore, and then just more downtime and out of service time because they're used and tired. So there's a lot there to kind of talk about. And I mean, I don't really ever envy anybody that's running a fleet right now, because it is probably one of the harder times to run a fleet and manage a fleet for sure.
It's Nick, and when each of you brought up some good points. So just two quick comments. One with respect to apparatus that was offline from frontline service and sent to the training academy. Those departments that I know, particularly a couple in upstate New York, that historically had the capability of doing that, rigs that were assigned to the training academy, the part of the thought process was these rigs are not going to ever be run on our city streets again. All right. So while they were typically the oldest version of what the current design was of what they had in the fleet, and they'd be maintained and safe for students to operate within a confined area on a driving course, driving pad or something like that. The thought process was, all right, it's kind of like if you had an engine and a truck dedicated to the training academy, for example, is that, all right, I can now take my limited resources that I have with my EVT mechanics and dedicate that to PMs and keeping the rest of the stuff on the street. Well, I know at least in two cases that have happened within the last year, rigs that were assigned to those jurisdictions' training academies, they had to be brought back into the shop, brought back up to snuff, so to speak, and they're going back out on the street because we ran out of reserves. And it went exactly to Nick's comment. Fortunately, it was during a time where they weren't doing a recruit academy. So if they were doing in-service training, all right, the companies are going to come down and use their rigs. So it didn't upset necessarily the training schedule, but it was like one more point of desperation is saying, all right, maybe in the future we need to think about, if the rig is about ready to come offline, and in the past, I'll not give it a second thought, we'll just give it a training. Now it's like we might have to pull that thing back. So if the rig was, that beat up and that bad a shape before we were going to sign it to training, maybe we need to bolster our reserve fleet. So that brings us to the point of say, what do you do if you don't have enough reserves? At least here locally, where I live up in a part of Virginia, a lot of it is just relationships with neighboring fire departments. Is that somewhere along the line, somebody might have a surplus of rigs. When Wynn mentioned before, somewhat of the prototypical large volunteer fire department that maybe not all in one station, but 3 engines, truck, and a rescue, a couple of medic units, pretty standard, and that's run of the mill, and it can get much larger from there. But if you're running a modest-sized career department and maybe have, a ratio of, you have 5 engine companies and you have 1 dedicated reserve, something happens, the reserve's already being pressed into place. You have an unfortunate, whether it's a mechanical issue, or you have, God forbid, you have an accident, all right, and now you're taking another frontline unit out of service. I think a lot of it has, and you need to do this proactively up front. You can't just say, go out to your secretary and say, hey, what's the number of the chief down and, fill out the blank county next to me. You got to get on. The last time I saw him was at a Chiefs meeting. Well, now I'm in really desperate shape. What are we going to do when you need to kind of be proactive with that ahead of time, so that you have at least some, not that they're easy, but alternatives, short of saying, as some folks have done, they're going out and buying a stock model pumper, one of a demonstrator unit, something that's available. And again, one county that I know that was doing this, the initial thought process was because they didn't have enough reserve engines, not anybody's fault. But as the department began, in that case, to expand and build new stations, well, they needed to bolster their reserve fleet. So their thought was, all right, we're going to go out and buy a couple of these program units. All right. And then because of other mechanical things going on, it's like, all right, well, we bought a new rig. They're probably not going to just mothball it and leave it back at the warehouse. We're going to put the thing in service. And on any given day, these things are running. So you then not only have the logistical issue of the apparatus, but in what differentiates between a reserve and a spare, for example, that's like a tanker tender issue. Some people would call a reserve just means the only thing that means, folks, is we got it to you here. We pulled it onto the ramp of your station and set the maxi brake. All right. Anything else? Now it's up to you. Now you're stripping your frontline rig of everything, including the kitchen sink, to go upfit the reserve or the spare rig. So now your reserves or spares, however your department identifies those, they got to be fully equipped. All right. Otherwise, you're taking a company out of service to switch out. All right. And that takes them offline for whatever time it takes them to switch out. The departments that do it correctly, I think, have typically fully equipped reserves, and maybe other than typically, the radios, ticks, and maybe the SCBAs. Other than that, it's an outfitted rig, and you don't make a run on the spare or reserve and then get to the scene and then realize, oh my God, we don't have a whatever. I guess we got to go back and retrieve that from our other rig.
So I got a couple things there, and I'll start with the stocking the apparatus as a logistics manager first. Tom, I don't know if you know this, but firemen don't steal things. They just borrow them and forget to give them back. So, normally when you find a fully outfitted engine company somewhere, there's something's not coming back from it.
Yeah, that's why in departments you say, historically back to the days where they went into early motorized rigs and they had, even a small department until they ran out of colors. It's like when you're sitting at a pre-construction conference, and after we've laid out the pump panel, they go, okay, we now need to do the colors. It's like, all right, each company had, had their tools, and even, back when you had brass couplings, they had the couplings on each length of hose, so everything was color coded, and then that was a massive improvement in the 70s when we came out with the advent of putting reflective striping on the apparatus. We had companies that developed, these labels to identify. It's the Tom Shan VFD. All right. So if I see the Slauch engine company waltzing down the street with a set of irons that's got my stickers on it, guess what's going to happen? But you're absolutely right. Yeah, we do a very good job of making sure that we have what we need, even if it legally doesn't belong to us.
I have a couple other things, from that, and again, I think the key is figure out alternatives. Not every department is going to be able to afford or be able to maintain a reserve apparatus or spare apparatus, whatever you want to call it, especially rurally. And I think you hit the nail on the head, is to have those relationships with your neighbors. And maybe you even have an agreement to where you do purchase a used or even a new at times unit that can run, depending on the amount of companies that are going to share this thing. Make that purchase and have an agreement to where you have a reserve sitting there that's available, for that. And, you have to have those conversations. Again, like I said, especially if you're sharing mechanics or things like that, as a unit either comes out of service, you can bump that back into a spare, and again, split the maintenance costs on it, but have it available for everybody. Purchase a new one that's split between 3 or 5 companies. I don't know. Again, I think that brings you to another question: is how similar does that frontline unit, or does your frontline unit need to be to reserve? If you're going to buy, like you said, a stock unit or something that's available, does it need to match everything that you do on a daily basis, or can you get by with certain things? Uh, and another thing that I have written down is if you're going to do an agreement like that, does purchasing a quint, in an area that doesn't normally run a quint, would that make sense to where you can maximize that reserve? I know we've talked about it before, Nick. Maximize that reserve as both an engine and ladder company. Um, that allows you to minimize some of that back end cost, but still gives you that reserve that you need for both units.
You make a good point when you talked about how closely it parallels the rig that you're running as a reserve, particularly if you had to acquire it from outside the normal sources. Whether you bought a demonstrator, a stock unit, a dealer demo, or you went out and bought from a reputable uh, firm a high quality used rig that it's going to be understandable that that rig, if lay it down to the case of an engine, all right, well, chances are the pump panel is not going to be identical, all right. We can train and get past that. It's got to have enough compartmentation to be able to carry what our normal assortment of equipment is, particularly if we're a ALS provider off the engine. And when you roll around the back, the hose load and complement. All right, we can buy a couple more dividers. We can adjust the dividers. We can make the dividers adjustable. It's got to, the back end's got to look like we would operate on any given basis. And I think therein is some of the things are the mindset. Uh, Nick, you might recall a couple of the fleet uh, jobs that we did where the department had a plethora of engines, and we suggested that one be upgraded and kind of designated as the fleet reserve, but that also meant that the nozzles needed to be upgraded. We couldn't be running the 1992 vintage Akron turbojets on there, where they had the selectomatics and it was clicked in on 60 GPM when the frontline unit was running, a more modern version, with something with a, automatic nozzle, but with a spin off with a slug tip. It'd be like, we have to draw a fine line operationally to say, all right, if we're going to go into a reserve or spare, that our operational capabilities, certainly from a safety standpoint, all right, if your frontline rig, God bless you, is outfitted with all the latest, safety equipment. It's got electronic stability control. It's got a reinforced steel front bumper. It's got frontal and side airbags. Your reserve unit might not have that. All right, from a safety standpoint, and we kind of have, not great, but we need to get beyond that. From an operational perspective, it has to give us the same capabilities that we've had. So if we're showing up on our brand new 2025 model versus our 2007 model, it's not like we're going back to the Stone Age and everybody's running around not screaming because we don't know what we're doing.
And I think that that's a good point. And I would challenge people to understand the mission of the reserve, right? We talk about mission of the frontline vehicle, and we're specing things new and things like that. But I think, especially in these times here, going outside the box is exactly what you have to do. So when we look at reserve ladder trucks, getting a quint instead of another engine for the area to be the reserve of all of these things, right? Like ISO doesn't really count that or recognize that. But at the end of the day, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for service delivery of the community. One thing that, we talked about reserves and backups, and this kind of hit Facebook somewhat recently. And Tom and I, we had talked about this on the phone, was the ladder tender concept out of Phoenix, right? And that thought process. There's a lot of places that we've gone that they will have 2 or 3 engines, a tanker, a couple brush trucks. They have a squad or a rescue squad, whatever you want to call it, some sort of extrication type vehicle and then a ladder truck sitting next door. And we've talked about combining those services and all those things back in the day, all that stuff. But most thought processes are we're going to bring that rescue squad into our non-hydrated area as our special service unit because a service company, ISO requires a service company that meets that kind of intent. So we're good to go. The problem is what they're lacking is the ground ladder capability. And we've preached this through many podcasts over the days that ground ladders are important, that we need to meet what the hazard is out there for ground ladders. And a lot of the times the rescue squads are either carrying the same complement or less. There's some rescue squads out there that don't have any ground ladders on them. And they're the ones responding to the structural fire. Now, zoom out to some of these larger jurisdictions when their ladder companies go out of service and there's no reserve. We saw it in upstate New York. We've seen it in other places where you go in there, you get the phone call, there's no reserve, and they say, hey, you're out of service. That lasts for so long. Then somebody in the higher offices says, hey, we're paying people to sit around and do nothing. Go put 4 or 5 SCBA in that pickup truck from the training academy, set of irons and a chainsaw, and maybe slap a 24-foot ladder on the roof rack there, and hey, truck 5's back in service. Let's go get it. And one of the things that it's hard for me to wrap my head around is you look back into the 20s and 30s and 40s, the really early times firefighting when Tom was 20 or 30 years old back then, and was probably a fire chief.
I'm not going to let that one go, but go ahead, Sonny. Make the comment.
Back in the day, you had ladder trucks with no compartments, and they were literally ladder trucks. They had a big ladder up top, and they had the torque box or the ladder tunnel chock full of ground ladders. The NFPA requirement was like 220 feet of ground ladders because that's what it would take to go and fully ladder a building. And now we kind of transition to this ladder trucks. With NFPA, the recommendation in the annex doesn't really require that many. You could have a ladder truck technically with no ground ladders, but you look at the reserves now, what people are pressing into service, and the ground ladders aren't even part of the conversation. It's a chainsaw, a set of irons, and an SCBA, and we're good to go. So how can we, look at that third engine? We're going to go buy a new engine for a reserve for the area. Maybe it doesn't have to have the Quint type setup where there's this big aerial ladder up top, but maybe it has dual ladder racks with 35s on them so that we can bring ground ladders when our regional ladder truck's out of service. Maybe one of the rescue squads, instead of having a walk-in area in the back, now we put a ladder tunnel back there and put a couple 35s and 28s and some ground ladders back there, and we just make a walk-around rescue that has the ability to be a rescue squad or some sort of a special service company for the area, right? I think there's a lot of things as we zoom out. Atlanta was another one that I saw hit the news where they bought these hybrid trucks, they called them. They brought 3 of them. Rather than have the aerial testing, and all the other things that come along with that, they were able to get 3 walk-around rescues with ladder tunnels, like ladder city service units, what they used to be called, put them in service for about half the price of buying 3 ladder trucks, and now they have something they can press into service quickly, easier, cheaper. It's not ideal, but it's a really good stopgap measure to get something in service. And I think that's the type of thinking in today's day and age that we need to be looking at, right? How can we meet the mission of the vehicle by speccing it, by looking at new vehicles? Does every engine in our 3-engine fleet have to have the same water tank? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe one has a 500-gallon water tank so that we have more capability for ladders or other equipment or rescue engine style to be that service company backup. You can have the best walk-in rescue squad in the world, and when it goes out, if there's no replacement for it, then we kind of have a problem.
Back to what you said about the engines, before you got into that, a couple years ago, I believe it was the city of New Haven put a quad in service, very similar to what you're talking about, where, it was a pumper, but it also had a more robust set of ground ladders on it. Like you said, it didn't have the dual ladder racks, but it had, it had more ladders. And I'm not going to try to quote what it had because it's probably 10 years old at this point, if not older. But And again, with the city service stuff, I think those are great alternatives. And that's, you look at it. Do you need a $2 to $2.5 million reserve ladder truck, to be in service, you know, depending on your fleet, anywhere between 10 and 25% of the year, maybe not, if, it's just out for the day to get the ladder testing done on it, or, out for PM, those are things where, like you said, you can get away with that, ground ladders. And if you look at what you do daily, if you're not throwing the aerial every day, again, if ground ladders are the bulk of what we do, and we just use the aerial ladder as a transport vehicle, then that city service truck makes a whole lot of sense. Um, and again, you can. It depends, I think, on your training at that point, whether you kind of bump it up to a rescue, or if you just keep it as a ladder truck, but just take the aerial off of it. Again, it depends on how your members are trained and what they can handle. But I think that those are, you have to look at the alternatives, and I have that down here. Is figure out the alternatives, like you said, split it with your neighbors, or look at an alternative that meets the majority of the needs, but would cost you a whole lot less. And again, take the maintenance aspects out of some of it, which would allow that thing to be in service a whole lot more as well.
Yeah, I mean, good example is the pumper tanker too. I mean, we've seen a bunch of pumper tankers out there where they explore the idea of getting a ladder truck, and you look and they put a 24 and a 14 on the side of this pumper tanker, this tandem axle, and it's taken up about a third of the side of the area on the side. And you're like, you have so much room. You could put a 2-section 35 and a 60 or an 18 on that side. And then the other side, if your dump tank's located somewhere else, or some departments don't run with a drop tank or a dump tank, you could put a 28 and a 16 on the other side. And I mean, that complement right there, if my ladder truck went down, that might be my special service. Put a chainsaw and a set of irons on there. And is it a good truck? Absolutely not. But at least it's going to bring you some ground ladders and some truck company equipment, and be able to, to be able to service the community. I mean, that was, anecdotally, Tom said something earlier. He said, what do you send a public safety announcement out when the ladder truck goes out? Like, hey, everybody on the third floor, go ahead and move down to the second floor of your dwelling, because if you're a third floor or higher, we can't service you now for the next 24 hours because our ladder truck's out getting preventative maintenance done.
Listen, I have to say this, that if where I live, if you don't put dump tanks on your tanker, and then you think that you're going to put ladders on it and tie it up on the scene somewhere where you need water moving, we're gonna have issues, Nick. We're gonna have issues.
Hey, I'm just saying, not every pumper tanker has dump tanks. I'm not saying right, wrong, or I'm not a water guy, man. I like ladders, so I think
both of you make a very, very good point. Is that on something that has a longer body profile, tandem axle, and it's got standard, engine equipment, and it's got a larger than standard tank. When you bring up the thought to the folks about having a different length ladder on there, they immediately just default and go, well, it is just a pumper, so a 14 and a 24 is going to work.
Right.
Like, but again, not knocking them, but in a prototypical volunteer department with multiple stations, you have to say, and how many of your engines are already going to show up with that? All right. Why did they call it no different than why all three of us got, exercised with the current version of 1900, when they took any reference to the ground ladders out of there and say, well, it's now the authority having jurisdiction. That's just handing it to a platter to the folks trying to sell you their brand and their make and model of rig to your department, to just say, well, this model is equipped with this. All right. And on engines where, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see. Probably no way to definitively, dial in on that. But how many of the proportion of new engines, once you take the FDNYs and your purely traditional style engine company out of the mix, what's the percentage of engines that have the ladders mounted on outboard on the officer's side of the rig in a somewhat standard or traditional configuration, compared to those where they're mounted and somehow embedded under the tank, through the tank, left or right side, and enclosed in the body. That in and of itself typically limits the length of ladders you can have, because now they're enclosed in the body, and at some point, even if they're going to protrude into the pump enclosure, now maybe you're nutsing up that area. So all these things have kind of, I think, somewhat snowballed. That somebody buying a ladder truck, you can generally get their attention, pretty easily by saying, "Excuse me, what's this called again?" Ladder truck, aerial ladder, tower ladder. And you can get them to engage a little bit on saying, like what your father would do, Nick. So let's ride around your first do and find out what length ladders you have, even when the NFPA had the standards in there, you know, before the prices exploded, and you could buy a ladder truck for $1 million. You really want to spend $1 million on something and carry 85 feet of ground ladders or 115 feet? My standard line was put a roof rack, change the light bar on the chief's buggy or the deputy's buggy, and put a roof rack, and you can throw all those damn ladders on top of the chief's vehicle. Be a heck of a lot cheaper. And now that aerial devices, a non-platformer bucket, they're pushing 2 million, and anything with that's a tower, no matter who's building it, it's 2.5 and up. Well, why are we calling it an aerial or a ladder device? And but again, we default and go back to the engines. And as much as we can get those folks to engage, they'll be like, well, it's an engine. What do I need? Well, I've always had a 14 and a 24. Well, how often do you throw them? So I think that's when it goes back to the mission of the vehicle. Are we going to use it? I think Atlanta made it sound like they just had invented this, and I think they were calling them alternative response vehicles, or they had some an acronym that made it look like, and one of their major problems was, like in a lot of cities, is that they couldn't keep their frontline stuff on the street for whatever reason. All right. So again, it's all fun and games until you run out of rigs in a career department and you're paying for people to come and, and staff your apparatus, and you don't have an appropriate style of rig for them to operate on. So whether it's having an alternative response vehicle in your system, having the ability to reach out to a neighbor, a smaller or larger jurisdiction, I think that's probably going on more often than not. But chiefs or fleet managers that want to keep their jobs, in the newspaper in one area where I lived, it was pretty. A lot of newspapers would have like the local police beat, but they'd also have like a listing of fire calls. What's going on. When you run out of fire trucks, you generally don't advertise that. All right, you certainly don't want to let it out to the press. So I think that kind of stuff, and those folks responsible for making sure that there's a viable, safe vehicle of some description to be in the firehouse when the brothers and sisters show up, at 0600 or 0700 to start their shift. That's becoming a lot more problematic than not, because those people sometimes are not necessarily in control, of where the vehicle's going, where the rig's moving, or what caused it to be out of service. And somebody else in the organization is trying to run down and find out, hey, it went out to an outside vendor. It went out a week ago Friday. Okay, well, what's going on? Well, the guy said he'd call me Thursday. Well, it's Tuesday today. Let's call, let's call and see if he can give us an update. I don't want to wait till Thursday to have to figure out I still have an ongoing problem. I'd like to try to get ahead of it.
I think the bigger issue of it all too is that this, we have the fire truck market. This has been going on for a little while now. I think at the beginning there's a shock. There's this awe. People are scrambling. I think there's still a little bit of that, but a lot of people are kind of cleaning that up, right? They have the rigs on order. Things are starting to move. That lead time is kind of holding strong / coming down, so people kind of know what to expect. And a lot of that stuff is kind of shaken out to an extent, right? Most people are aware of it, especially the larger fleets. They're trying to do what they can do to overcome it. I just think that we're in now phase 2 of this problem. This isn't something that's going to go away. And I think that's why I wanted to kind of do this podcast now, is the reserve apparatus, with how long people are keeping them. The used market's not going to be as strong because people are holding on to rigs longer. So you're not going to find that diamond in the rough of that great rig that's going to be, kind of ready to go and serve the community. So that's going to be difficult to fix your problem. Buying a fire truck takes way too long to have any result or any significant impact in a short amount of time. And so for your reserve fleet, if you're not bolstering it now with the way the electronics are going, I mean, look at what the future is going to hold. In less than 2 years, we have a new motor coming in, and not anybody out there can tell you what that's going to do to the fire truck, whether it's going to be pro or con, right? We could have a disaster like in '08 and 9, or 11 and 12, when we had some of the def regen motor issues. And if you don't bolster your fleet now and hold on to those rigs, if there's some sort of a motor issue, and with us in Arlington, we deliver 4 fire engines and 2 trucks and a rescue squad. That's like a third of our fleet. We don't have that in reserve to be able to overcome that. And if it's a motor issue like that, there's only so many players in the game, and so there could be really big consequences across the entire fire service. So it's, I'm not sitting here in front of Senate and sounding the alarm or anything to that nature. But I think that is something, as a fleet manager, as anybody in charge of a fire company, riding a fire truck, has any sort of, finger on the pulse. If you're not paying attention to the fire truck market now, definitely open your eyes to what the future of 5 or 6 years from now can hold. I mean, looking at that reserve fleet and looking at used rigs coming in and seeing what you can do to bolster it up, for training, for operations, for everything, and coming up with those off the wall ideas. The hybrid truck, the city service, the pumper tanker with ground ladders, the engines with that we can rehab or refurb to bolster the capacity, or maybe swap a tank out on an engine to go to 1,000 instead of 500 to be the backup pumper tank. Whatever it is, right? There's a lot of options out there. Look around the internet and kind of explore all those different thoughts, because I just don't see this getting any better anytime soon. Parts availability, quality of rigs, all of those things are going to be an issue for a while.
Yeah, completely agree. I think one of the since one of the mantras in the military was improvise, adapt, and overcome. All right, and I think that's where we need to be. Those folks that think that because of where the current political climate is, that all of a sudden they're going to wave the magic wand and fire apparatus is going to become exempt from from any of these EPA regulations. That's not happening. The technology is here currently that we've had to deal with, as Nick referenced. A lot of the issues that occurred, particularly after the post 2009 EPA version engines, where folks claimed, "Oh, that can't happen. That can't happen." No, the rig is never just going to all of a sudden shut down. And then you talk to drivers and uh, and technicians that had that happen to them for any number of reasons. It's just like it's still we're still going to be in the unknown for a while until all of these things uh, get sorted out. Uh, the engine offerings that are out there, the manufacturers are working on them, but we still don't really know what's the impact going to be in short wheelbase engines within the pump box on the right side, or the impact on any kind of aerial device in the right front compartment where the canisters are going to get double stacked. So it's not going to get any easier. That's for sure. And I think the having having good knowledge of your system, of your statistics that you can then use to go promote as to why you need, if you're going to go out and buy, if your department's never bought a used rig before, or bought anything other than we sat around a table, had an apparatus committee, decided what we wanted, and then went out, purchased it, waited whatever time went through the system and we took delivery of it, the thought of doing something different than what your previous game plan allowed probably is going to be a little scary. All right. So that's why you need to kind of plan ahead and run the stats. And if you find out that your in service, your actual in service and uptime is falling short of what your benchmark, what you're shooting for, the good Lord's telling you something. You need to start working on it. It's just not going to self correct overnight.
I think stocking parts is a big one. If there was advice that we could put out there, if you have a larger fleet, stocking parts is going to be huge ahead of time. Monitoring what is putting rigs out of service. If you have, we faced this in Arlington. We had a rotation motor go on one of the ladder trucks, and we found it during our annual inspection. Another one was starting to leak. They just ordered another rotation motor. I mean, we can't afford to have trucks go out of service for a long time. We can't afford to drop ship stuff overnight at $4, $5, $6, $7,000 for some of the parts just for overnight shipping, and have the truck sit for 24, to 48 hours waiting for those parts to come in if it's available and on the shelf, right? So that's a lot of stuff. But some of these parts are $10, $15, $20,000, but what is your out of service time and what is your lack of that service worth, right? So can you afford, it's $20,000 worth having a ladder truck be out of service and for career personnel sitting and looking at themselves in the bay of the firehouse? So what's that number look like to you, and have those conversations early. Just like we plan for mass casualty and larger scale events, once or twice a year, sit down and have that plan around the table as chiefs now of, hey, we got 3 engines and a truck goes out of service. It went on the highway and got hit by a tractor trailer. What are we going to do tomorrow? Do we send an engine out to get rehab, to get more ladders? Do we buy a used one? Do we, I've seen or heard of departments, medium-sized departments leasing trucks from other volunteer companies just to get ladder trucks in service that are career staff. Again, making those conversations early and figuring out what the options are. Used fire trucks, looking at the market to see what's out there. Just scooping something up that's cheap, that seems like it could be a good deal just to have something to give. Run orders, are you putting, a lot of people like the bigger ladder trucks and rescue squads to block. If you only have one ladder truck in your jurisdiction and that's your blocking rig, daily, at least weekly, something's getting hit on the highway. And so that's a huge risk. I would rather it be a fire truck than a person every day, all day. That's never up for debate. But do you send 2 engines up there now and use the engines to block because you have reserves for them? I don't know what the answer is, right? But you have to sit around those tables and have those conversations now, because not talking about it means that you're just going to be faced with this one day. And I hope it gets better. I hope it doesn't happen that way. But I just see this going into a really bad direction if we're not paying attention and being proactive in those bigger, moderate to bigger size fleets. You're just going to be the next one in the headline. I mean, over the last 5 years, take any major city and pretty much copy and paste the headline of rigs are out of service and nowhere for people to ride, and unions, complaining about it, and the citizens are up in arms. That's pretty much every major city across the country in the last 5 years has gone through some sort of cycle of that. So that kind of here to raise some awareness and hopefully, throw out some ideas and hopefully get people to be in a better spot. So as we kind of wrap this up, I'll throw it to Wynn for some parting thoughts. I kind of said my piece a little bit, and then we'll go to you, Tom, and we can kind of wrap this up about the reserve apparatus and the market as it goes in general.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just jump back into a couple of things that we said there. Is if you don't have a reserve program and you're looking at it, like Nick said, take a holistic look at your functions, everything that you do and provide, and make sure that you're not relying on those reserve apparatuses to be able to cover those functions as well, such as the training academy. When you're building that out, make sure you're looking at the mission. What do you need this reserve apparatus to do? And then what alternatives can allow you to accomplish the same thing, or at least provide a very similar set of skills or services to the community. I think that's the key. But use everything that you have available, and it goes back to everything we've talked about before. Is make sure you're keeping track and you're documenting things, and that you have good records of everything, including maintenance records to allow you to make these right decisions as you look at what is required to keep your fire department in service.
Tom, we'll go over to you. Any parting words?
Yeah, I think all good points. Look at your mission that you have in the department. Everybody says, we're here to protect to save lives and property, right? Look at your benchmarks and do a critical dive into seeing how you're meeting those objectives. And if you're not, don't hide it. All right, don't sugarcoat it. Let the other people in the organization that are above your rank and advise them as to where you're at, so that you can plan appropriately. Uh, and doing that would hopefully put your organization in a much better position uh, when you're called to duty and the tones go off and you go out. Your crews will appreciate the fact that you're keeping up on the actual numbers of what's going on, not just reacting to the daily complaints that come in with the emails saying, oh, this is wrong or that's wrong. You need to have a holistic approach to your maintenance program.
Yeah, data and proactive maintenance, huge components. Well, I hope all those guys and gals listening were able to glean some information, and we still have a positive outlook on life. Don't worry. We did talk about some doom and gloom today, but I think these are all important conversations that need to be had around the kitchen table, and even higher up in the offices. Make that plan. Kind of do that tabletop of what would kind of happen and who you call and what would happen. What numbers you have in your Rolodex, like Tom said in the beginning. But everyone, be safe out there. Hope all goes well into the holiday season, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Apparatus Workshop.